Before dawn broke over the sleepy town, a jogger cutting through the forest trail noticed a German shepherd sitting completely still beside a battered cardboard box, and what struck him was how the dog stared at him, not with fear but with urgency, as if begging him to come closer. The air was sharp with the chill of early morning, and the forest was still cloaked in mist, but something about the way the dog stayed frozen, ears up, eyes locked on him, made the jogger stop in his tracks. He squinted through the low fog, unsure if he was looking at an abandoned animal or some trick of the light. But as he took a cautious step forward, the dog shifted, just slightly, not in aggression, but in alertness. The trail was one he had run dozens of times before, and he knew every bend, every tree, every odd stump. But he had never seen a dog like this, and certainly never a box dumped just off the gravel path, barely hidden beneath a few low branches. The jogger hesitated, glancing down the path behind him, wondering if he should just keep going, if it was none of his business. But something told him this was different, something felt off, and the dog never looked away. He stepped into the brush, carefully avoiding the thorns that snagged at his sweatpants. The box was soggy at the bottom and looked like it had been there overnight, its flaps sagging inward and covered in dew, and the dog moved with him, not menacing, not barking, just pacing alongside him with slow, deliberate steps, like a sentry showing the way. As he got closer, the dog sat again directly in front of the box, not blocking it, but almost pointing to it, and tilted its head in a strange, silent plea. The jogger crouched down, heart pounding louder now than his footsteps had been. He reached for the corner of the box and peeled back the flap, and that was when he saw it, a small round face barely visible under the folds of a dirty towel, tiny fingers curled into fists resting near flushed cheeks, a faint breath rising and falling from an impossibly small chest. The baby did not cry, did not stir, just remained there, silent, still, and terrifyingly fragile. The jogger blinked, not believing what he was seeing. He looked back at the dog, whose eyes remained fixed on the baby, as if watching for any sign of distress, then looked back at him with what he could only describe later as a question or maybe a plea, and the jogger's throat tightened as he reached for his phone, his hands fumbling over the screen as he called emergency services, trying to keep his voice steady, telling the operator there was a baby in a box in the woods and a dog that would not leave its side. The operator asked questions he could barely answer. How old was the baby? Was it breathing? Was it injured? He kept saying it was alive but quiet and looked cold but okay. And then he added something that surprised even him. The dog was keeping it warm. The dog was guarding it. The operator paused, then told him to stay there and help was on the way, and not to approach further if he thought the dog might be dangerous. But the jogger said, "No, this dog is not dangerous. This dog is doing something I cannot explain." As he waited crouched near the box, the dog sat beside him, watching both him and the baby, and every time the baby made the smallest noise, the dog would lean in and give a low, gentle whine, as if trying to comfort it. And the jogger realized he had never seen anything like this, not in real life, not in stories. This was something else. This was something no one would believe unless they saw it themselves. Heart pounding, the jogger approached slowly, and the dog neither growled nor moved, only glanced down at the box, then back up at him, until he finally peeked inside and froze. A baby no older than a few weeks lay curled and silent, wrapped in a threadbare towel, its tiny chest rising and falling weakly. And in that moment, time seemed to slow down. The trees around him faded into a blur, and the only thing that mattered was the fragile life in that box, and the animal who had not left its side. The jogger did not know much about babies. He had never held one, never changed a diaper, never been near a newborn. But he knew what cold looked like, and he knew what it meant when a baby was too quiet, too still, too pale. He leaned closer as gently as he could, trying not to let his breath fog the little face, and he thought he saw the faintest flicker in the baby's eyelids, maybe even a flutter of a finger, but it was hard to be sure. The dog whined softly again, as if urging him to do something, to hurry, to fix this, and the jogger pulled off his jacket and laid it over the box, adding what warmth he could without touching the child directly. He glanced at his phone. The emergency dispatcher was still on the line, asking if the baby was breathing, if the dog had attacked, if he felt safe. And the jogger kept repeating, "Yes, yes, the baby is breathing, and the dog is not a threat, the dog is trying to help." The dispatcher told him that help was minutes away and to stay calm, to talk if the baby woke up, to let it hear a voice. And so the jogger started talking. He spoke softly, not knowing what to say, telling the baby that everything would be okay, that someone was coming, that it was not alone, and the dog seemed to settle hearing his voice, lying down beside the box, with its head on its paws, but eyes always open, always watching. It struck the jogger then how strange it was that the dog had not run off, that it had stayed there all night through wind and frost and darkness, and had not moved until someone finally came, as if it had made a promise and refused to break it. He wondered how long the dog had been there, and if it had been lying there for hours, if it had barked at every squirrel and raccoon that came too close, or if it had just lain there in the silence, keeping its small charge safe. Then a sound came from the trail behind him, sirens in the distance, the low crunch of footsteps over gravel, and he turned to see a pair of paramedics rushing toward him, their eyes widening when they saw the scene. A man crouched by a box in the woods, a baby inside, and a German shepherd lying beside it like a living shield. They moved fast, asking questions, checking the baby's vitals, wrapping it in blankets, and the dog stood up suddenly tense, but did not interfere, just watched closely as if needing to know the strangers were not a threat. And when one of the paramedics reached down to pat its head, the dog did not flinch, it simply stared back, then sat again, like it understood the moment had come and its job was done. The dogger stepped back, watching as the team carried the baby away, the dog following a few steps behind until they gently blocked its path, and for a second no one moved. Then the dog sat once more right there on the edge of the trail, its tail still, its ears perked, its eyes never leaving the baby, now safe in the arms of strangers who had come to take over what it had guarded through the night. The dog gave a soft bark as if to say hurry, and the jogger's shaking hands dialed for help, when the dog gently nudged the box closer to the path where morning light could find it faster, and the baby whimpered faintly for the first time. The sound was so soft the jogger almost missed it, but it was enough to make his chest ache with a kind of desperate relief, and the dog turned toward the baby, its ears perking as though it too had been waiting for that tiny sign of life. The paramedics worked quickly, wrapping the baby in a thick foil blanket, checking its breathing, checking its temperature, speaking in urgent but calm tones, and the jogger could only stand there as they did their work, trying to understand how any of this was real. The forest, that had always seemed so quiet, so uneventful, had turned into something else entirely, and in the middle of it all stood a dog that refused to leave the baby's side no matter what. When one of the responders reached down to check the dog's tag, they realized it had none, no collar, no ID, no sign of where it had come from, and still the dog stayed close, watching every move they made. One of the paramedics knelt and offered the dog a biscuit from his pouch, and though the dog sniffed it politely, it did not eat. Instead, it returned its gaze to the baby, as if its only need in the world was to see that child safe. The police arrived next, taking statements, asking questions, snapping photos of the scene, but none of them could explain it. None of them had ever seen a dog behave this way. It was not just loyalty, it was something else, a sense of purpose, a silent devotion that none of the officers could ignore. One of them knelt beside the dog and said, "You're something special, aren't you?" And the dog looked at him, then back at the baby, and stayed where it was. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sound of sirens, and soon the once empty trail was dotted with people staring, whispering, taking photos, and among them came an older woman who claimed she had seen the dog wandering the woods for weeks, always alone, never barking, never aggressive, and she had tried to coax it toward her once with food, but it had refused to come near, and now she looked at it with tears in her eyes, saying it was like the dog had been waiting for something all this time. The baby was placed into the ambulance, and just as the doors were about to close, the dog jumped up and barked again, loud and sharp, startling everyone, and then it sat back down, tail sweeping slowly across the ground, and the jogger stepped forward and said, "I think it wants to go with the baby. I think it knows it's not done yet." But the paramedics shook their heads, saying animals weren't allowed in the vehicle, and they'd have to take it to animal control for now. As the ambulance pulled away, the dog watched it, until the red lights disappeared behind the trees. And only then did it lower its head slowly and lie down in the spot where the box had been resting, its chin on its paws and its body still as stone, and the crowd fell into silence watching this strange, quiet creature who had just helped save a life and expected nothing in return. A local animal officer gently approached with a leash, but the dog didn't resist. It stood walked beside the officer without protest, but every few steps it turned its head toward the road where the ambulance had gone, and no one could say for sure, but it seemed to be listening, hoping maybe to hear a sound, to know that the baby it had protected was still breathing, still warm, and still alive. Paramedics arrived, and while they worked, the dog refused to leave, circling protectively as if it were the baby's own guardian, and the team later said, had the dog not stayed, the baby might not have survived the night because the temperature had dropped dangerously low, and any longer out there alone could have been fatal. But the warmth from the dog's body and the way it had curled itself against the box had made the difference, and everyone on the scene knew it, even if they could hardly believe it. As the baby was rushed to the hospital with police escort, the German Shepherd was taken to the local shelter, not because it had done anything wrong, but because no one knew where it belonged and regulations required a stray to be held before adoption. The officer who brought it in kept repeating that the dog was special, different, that it had saved a life, and that it should be treated with respect and care, and the shelter staff agreed, placing it in a quiet space with blankets and food, though the dog barely touched anything. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the baby was placed in intensive care, and doctors began their assessments and tests, quickly confirming signs of dehydration and mild hypothermia, but also noting that the child was stable, a miracle considering how long it must have been outside. And soon whispers began to spread through the hospital hallways about the dog that had stayed by the child's side through the night and saved it from what could have been a quiet death in the cold woods. Reporters started calling, and news vans appeared outside the shelter and hospital asking questions about the baby, about the dog, about the jogger who had made the call, and the story took on a life of its own. People were amazed by the loyalty of the animal and the strange beauty of the moment, how a forgotten child had been protected by a nameless creature that could have walked away at any time but did not. Back at the shelter, the dog paced back and forth in its kennel, whining softly every time a child passed by, as if hoping one of them might be the baby. It had watched over its eyes, searching faces, listening for that soft whimper it had heard in the woods, and the shelter staff began calling it Hero because no one knew its name, and the name just seemed to fit perfectly. Volunteers arrived with treats and toys and beds and blankets, but Hero paid little attention to any of it, only growing still when someone came in carrying an infant, and though it was not the same baby, Hero pressed against the kennel gate, ears perked, tail slowly wagging, as if something inside had sparked again, and the shelter staff took note and marked that Hero seemed drawn to children more than anything else. At the hospital, doctors and nurses took turns holding the baby during shifts, unable to stop themselves from forming an emotional attachment, and a pediatric nurse who had been present during the baby's arrival found herself returning even on her days off, just to check in, just to see the child breathe and sleep and grow stronger. And though she had no children of her own, she felt something awaken in her that she could not explain. Soon police announced they were working hard to identify the baby's parents or anyone who might know where it came from. But in the meantime, custody remained with the hospital, and interest in both baby and dog surged online. Thousands of people asked to adopt the child or the dog or both, and donations began pouring in from across the country. But still, in the quiet hours when the cameras were gone and the reporters had packed up, Hero remained curled in its kennel, silent and alert, staring at the door as if waiting patiently for the moment it would be called back to the side of the child it had once chosen to protect, with nothing more than instinct, loyalty, and a heart that never asked for recognition. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the baby was cold, hungry but alive, and everyone from nurses to reporters wanted to know how a stray dog ended up guarding an abandoned newborn in the woods in the dead of winter. And the story began to spread beyond the town, picked up by national networks and online outlets with headlines calling the German Shepherd a hero, a guardian angel, a miracle with fur, and the public response was overwhelming as people everywhere sent messages of thanks, support, and offers to adopt both the dog and the child. Inside the hospital, the pediatric nurse who had first cared for the baby found herself more and more attached, visiting the infant every chance she got, holding the tiny hand, speaking in soft tones, and watching as the child's strength returned day by day. And in her heart, she began to hope for something she had never dared to imagine before, the possibility of becoming a mother. And somehow she felt as though this child had chosen her just as the dog had chosen to stay. Meanwhile, at the local animal shelter, Hero remained quiet, reserved, uninterested in toys or treats, and only showing signs of life when young children visited or when the television played the sound of a baby crying. Then the dog would stand alert, tail wagging, ears perked, eyes scanning as if expecting to see the child it had once guarded in the box beneath the trees. The staff noticed this and began taking turns sitting by the kennel, playing soft recordings of baby sounds just to comfort the dog, and though it helped a little, Hero never truly relaxed. The police investigation continued as officers canvassed neighborhoods, distributed photos, and asked for any information about a woman who might have recently given birth. And within days, a tip came in from a neighbor who had noticed a teenage girl looking pale and thin, and no longer pregnant, and quietly coming and going from a rundown house near the forest edge. When detectives arrived, the girl answered the door with tears already in her eyes, and before they could ask a single question, she whispered, "I am sorry, I didn't know what else to do." At the station, she told them everything. She had been hiding the pregnancy for months, afraid, ashamed, too young, and too alone. She had given birth in secret, and for a day she held the baby, unsure what to do. And then, with winter closing in, and no food, no heat, and no one to help, she bundled the child in a towel and walked into the forest, thinking she might find a safe place to leave her, not to harm her, but to give her a chance, she said. And then she saw the dog watching her from the trees. She recognized the dog. It had wandered through the woods near her house many times, quiet and calm, never bothering anyone, and in her heart she hoped maybe the dog would understand, maybe it would stay and somehow protect the baby. And she whispered a prayer and placed the box down, and the dog stepped forward slowly and sat beside it and never moved. And then she walked away, crying with each step, until she reached home and collapsed in her bed, convinced she had done the only thing she could. The officers believed her. They saw the guilt and the fear and the strange hope behind her story, and they decided not to charge her, instead referring her to social services for help and counseling. And the town reacted with surprising compassion, many saying the real miracle was that in her darkest moment, the girl had trusted the right dog, and that trust had saved her life and maybe two. Back at the hospital, the baby continued to gain weight and strength, and the nurse who had stayed by the child's side since the beginning decided to file papers for emergency guardianship. And when asked why, she said, "Because this child already has a protector, and now they need a home where both of them can be safe and together." Police knocked on doors for days until they found a teenage girl just a few miles away who tearfully confessed to abandoning the baby after being overwhelmed by fear and isolation, and said she had seen the dog before and hoped it might watch over her child. And though the officers expected denial or panic, what they saw instead was a girl barely out of childhood herself, trembling hands clutching her sleeves, eyes red, and voice barely above a whisper as she told them she had not meant to hurt the baby, only to give it a chance. She spoke about long nights alone in a cold house, about a missing mother and a father who never came home, and how the pregnancy had been a secret carried like a weight she could not share. And when the baby was born, she felt both love and terror, so deep it crushed her breath. And she remembered the dog who had lingered near her backyard, the one that never barked or begged, but always watched, and she believed somehow that it would know what to do if she could not. The officers listened, quietly exchanging glances, as she described wrapping the baby in the warmest towel she had, and walking into the woods in the early hours while the town slept and the trees stood silent. She placed the box gently near the path and sat beside it for minutes that felt like hours, hoping for a sign that she was not downing her child. And then the dog appeared, stepping out of the fog without a sound and sitting down beside the box as if it had been summoned. The girl said she looked into the dog's eyes, and for the first time in days, she felt a sliver of peace, as if something greater had stepped in where no one else had, and she stood up, whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked away without looking back. The officers left her house in silence, unsure what to feel, but knowing this was not a case for punishment. This was something different, something raw and human and painfully tragic. When the news reached the hospital, the nurse holding the baby sat down quietly and wept, not because she was angry, but because she understood the fear of loneliness, the weight of choices made without support. And as she looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully wrapped in warm blankets, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She would not let the child be passed from home to home. She would give them a place to stay forever. Meanwhile, the dog remained at the shelter, resting more than before, as if sensing that the danger had passed, that its task had been completed, but it still rose each time a baby cried on television or a visitor passed with a stroller, and it would wait by the gate, tail moving slowly, eyes fixed, and ears high as though scanning the faces for the one it had protected. The town began to talk of reunification, not of mother and baby, but of baby and dog, and soon word reached the shelter that the nurse had filed official adoption papers for both the child and for Hero, and within hours arrangements were made to release the dog into her care. And when the nurse arrived with a blanket from the hospital, Hero stood up immediately, nose twitching, tail wagging, eyes soft and certain, as if it had known she would come. When the nurse knelt and opened her arms, Hero walked into them, without hesitation, pressing its head into her chest, as she whispered thank you again, and promised they would never be apart again. And everyone watching that moment felt something shift, as if the world for just 1 second had made a little more sense, and the quiet bond between a baby, a dog, and a woman who had chosen love over fear became something no one would forget. The town rallied to support both the child and the German Shepherd, who was temporarily placed in a shelter until dozens of adoption offers poured in along with donations for the baby's care, and soon local businesses held fundraisers, school children made handmade thank you cards, and a bakery downtown even created cookies shaped like tiny paw prints with the word Hero written across the middle. And the story had become more than just news, it had become a symbol, a quiet reminder that hope could come from the most unexpected places. In the days that followed, the nurse who had begun the adoption process found herself surrounded by kindness. Strangers brought her baby clothes, formula, diapers, and toys, and many of them asked to meet the dog, whose silent bravery had captured the heart of a community. And each time someone knelt down to thank Hero, the dog would tilt its head, listen closely, and then gently place its paw on their knee, as if to say it had only done what was right. Children began visiting the shelter just to see Hero before the adoption was finalized, some of them afraid of dogs before, but now curious and brave, reaching out with small hands and wide eyes. And every time Hero would lie down calmly and let them approach, its tail sweeping the ground slowly, as if it understood that these children were not here to judge or question, only to offer love. The nurse took Hero on quiet walks through the park, where people stopped her with tears in their eyes, some with stories of their own loneliness, others who had once given up hope but had found something healing in the story of a dog who chose to stay when it could have walked away. And she listened to each one with patience and grace, letting them pet Hero, letting them feel for a moment that they too were part of this miracle. Meanwhile, the baby continued to grow stronger, smiling, now reaching for fingers, grasping at blankets, and making sounds that filled the hospital room with new life. And one morning the nurse brought Hero into the room for a supervised visit, and as soon as Hero saw the baby, its ears lifted, its head tilted, and its body stilled in that same protective posture from the woods, watching over the child, not with fear but with recognition and something deeper. The nurse carefully placed the baby in a small seat near the window, and Hero walked over slowly, nose twitching, tails still, and then gently sat beside the baby, never breaking eye contact. And in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something that words could not quite describe, a bond that had been formed not by command or training, but by instinct, by something pure and unspoken. The doctors were moved, the staff stood silent, and the nurse reached down, placing her hand on Hero's back, whispering thank you once more. And this time the dog looked up at her, with eyes full of calm, full of something that felt almost human. And it was then that the nurse knew she had made the right decision, not just to adopt the baby, but to bring them together again, to keep them side by side, as they had been on that cold morning in the woods. Soon paperwork was finalized, announcements were made, and people gathered for a small celebration at the hospital, where the baby was officially released into the nurse's care, and Hero was handed over with a new collar, a new tag, and a new home waiting just across town. And the mayor spoke briefly about community and compassion, and how one silent act of loyalty had reminded them all what it meant to care for others without question, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. The days passed quietly as the nurse settled into her new life with the baby and Hero, and each morning as the sun rose they would walk together through the park, the baby in a stroller wrapped in warm blankets, and Hero at her side, eyes alert but calm, tail swaying slowly, and the neighborhood began to know them by name, seeing them together as a family, one that had been formed not through blood or chance, but by something deeper than either of those. People still stopped them on their walks to ask about the baby and the dog, and to thank Hero for its role in saving a life, and sometimes the nurse would smile and tell them how the dog had never left the baby's side, and how it had stood watch over a tiny life with nothing but love and devotion to guide it. And when people asked about the baby's mother, the nurse would gently explain that the girl was getting help, and that she was receiving the care she needed to start over, but that the baby was now safe and loved and had a home. The dog, though, had made it clear from the beginning that it was not just a companion, it was a protector, a guardian, and it had decided long before anyone else that this baby was its responsibility. And every day as the baby grew stronger and more active, Hero seemed to grow calmer too, as if it knew its job was done, its role in the story had ended, and now it would rest knowing that its choice to stay had made all the difference. Sometimes in the evening, the nurse would sit by the fire holding the baby close, and Hero would curl up beside her, head on its paws, eyes half closed, but always alert, always ready to rise if needed. And at night, the baby would sleep soundly beside Hero's bed, and the dog would never stray far, always keeping watch, always listening for sounds outside the house or movements in the shadows. But never once did it grow restless or anxious, only peaceful, knowing that the little one beside it was safe. In time, the town stopped talking about the dog and the baby as a news story, and started to see them as part of the community, as if they had always been there, always belonged. And when the nurse walked into the local bakery one morning with Hero by her side, the baker called out to them in greeting, smiling and waving, and the townspeople would nod and wave whenever they passed on the street, as if the bond between them all had somehow deepened since that cold morning in the woods. The dog and the baby became a symbol of hope, not just for the town but for everyone who had followed their story from the beginning. And one day the nurse received a letter from someone who had been moved by the story, and in it they shared their own experience of hardship and loneliness, and how the story of the dog's loyalty had inspired them to reach out to others. And it was a letter that the nurse would keep forever as a reminder of how something as simple as a stray dog's choice to stay had changed everything. Years passed, and the baby grew into a toddler full of life and laughter, always reaching for Hero's fur and pulling gently at its ears, and Hero never once objected, always patient, always gentle with the child. And the nurse often marveled at how the dog had become so much a part of their family, how it had woven itself into the fabric of their lives, without question, without expectation. And in the quiet moments when the world outside seemed distant and the family was wrapped in warmth together, the nurse would look at Hero and the child, and she would think about how this all began, how one choice, one small act of loyalty had created something beautiful, something that would last forever, something that could never be broken.